function up? Yeah, I've got lots of interesting points coming over on the chat. But I wonder if it'd be nice if someone could kick off with unmute themselves and ask a question to one of our panel. If you do ask a question, could you say who you are and maybe who you represent as an organisation, if you do represent somebody, and maybe who your question is to. And I think it'd be nice to go and have a discussion for about 20 minutes to half an hour or so. So does somebody out there have a question? Tumbleweed. Jacqueline and Esther, can you unmute people? Can people unmute themselves?
Hi, Leo. Everyone can unmute themselves. It may be as well if people want to speak. I think if they wave their arm and get invited, it might make them feel more comfortable. Anybody?
Okay,
anybody
let me go on to gallery view and I can see if anybody's waving me. I've got Scott. Scott.
Hey, Leo.
Scott, kick us off.
Yeah, it's Scott Adams here, urban designer. I was just thinking, while different people were speaking, just how we go back to building great places that we love, which are, 50, 100 years ago, that probably had less rules. And how do we deal with that situation that some of these great places, fundamentally probably did relate to the car, but how do we relate to those places compared to what we're proposing today in these ideal systems, and also relating to local communities?
I think that's a brilliant question, and it's something that came up with the Planning Act coming in 1947, and a lot of places that people love are places that were built long before that. It's a great question. Who would like to take that? David, do you want to kick off with that one? You're going to have to unmute yourself.
I'm trying. Yeah, good. Yes, exactly. I mean, the point being that the system we had before 1947, the system that built the early garden cities, was a system based around very much what we've just been suggesting. We messed it up completely in 1947. And we did so, to be honest, because we assumed that the government would be the main developer in the UK. So the government would build town centres, would build council housing, would build new towns and so on. And actually the system we created was for the rump of development, which was thought to be about a quarter of development, which should be privately developed, and it would be sort of domestic and so on. And of course, we have a system now where that assumption is completely wrong. And so the system is creating endless arguments. I mean, one of the problems, as Jennifer said, is that it creates a huge amount of work for lots of consultants who get paid very well out of it. I'm always amazed when I'm doing a master plan and the planning consultants almost seem happy if there's a prospect of refusal, because it means another fee to do the appeal. The system is entirely adversarial, and everyone is focused on that rather than creating good places. So we do. The other point is that we then focus on saying what a good place looks like, and we all know what a good place looks like. The problem is we can't create it when we're focusing on the goal without giving ourselves the tools to achieve that.
Thank you, David. Kaye, would you like to, from a kind of different perspective, an architectural perspective, I think it'd be nice.
Yeah, it's quite interesting actually. We've recently been working outside London and out in the kind of rural areas, and we are trying to grapple with the idea of how do you create something not a kind of pastiche housing estate with David's earlier kind of noodly, I think it was David, noodly kind of cul-de-sacs, but what is it, try to grapple with what is it that makes these places that spring up over time so lovely, and it's really difficult. We've sort of pinned it down to a few things. I think looking at routes and construction, looking at routes and where people go and what they do, and actually looking at densities as well, and then that led us. The next step was then looking at the car and going, actually, it's the car that screws these places up. All these historic towns that are so gorgeous and lovely that everyone likes, and not designed around the car. What is it they say? 40% of all new housing developments, certainly outside of London in suburbs and places like, let's say, Stockport, are taken up by the car. And so I don't know, but I think certainly knocking the car on the head and dealing with that whole business of not being reliant on it, not giving the space for it, providing alternative, providing bicycles, routes, space for bicycles. I think that's got to be a really positive step in the right direction as to how you can even begin to look at some kind of comparable between historic lovely towns and new places that we're designing.
Thank you. Should we have another question? Wave at me or unmute yourself. Okay, so I've got one from Thaddaeus, and then I'm going to come to Steve and Tarry. So, Thaddaeus.
Hi, so I'm Thaddaeus J Browne from Lambert, Smithhampton. I'm just wondering, is it not now? Are we not at the time when actually we need to look at removing the power and involvement of politicians from the planning system? So specifically planning committees, because I think, you know, realistically, one of the slides talked about being an expert-led system, and we do at the moment have ultimately politicians who have a trump card over the advice and opinion of the experts.
Great question, Thaddaeus. Just so we get all of our panel involved, Colin or Jennifer, would you like to take that question?
Yeah, I can take that question. I think democracy, that's a very dangerous thing, but I think we have to dilute the power of councillor decision making, and I think we do that, and it was one of the things I was alluding to when you bring forward a planning application, to show true consultation and to have, you know, some interesting things about a young person's panel. That becomes a very important thing to the decision making, to have a group of experts like quality review panels actually contributing to the process. And so we're not seeing decision making based on short-term politics. We're actually diluting that. I mean, ultimately, those are elected representatives, and it's very dangerous if we move away from such democratic processes. But what I do think is that greater consideration needs to be given to real participation. And it also comes back to the process in terms of the plan making, and what we were alluding to is what goes into law and what doesn't, and the presumption in favour of the development plan and material considerations. We're given too much debate within the sort of system in some ways. And I think, we need more debate and more contribution by a wider people, and that needs to be essential to any decision making. And also it depends on the tools we're actually using to make those decision making.
Very good, thank you, Jennifer. Colin, would you like to come in on this as well, just to get everybody involved, getting rid or having less power with the politicians?
I think more trust in experts will reap great rewards. I mean, in the last 9 weeks, Leo, you and I are very lucky because we can deal with our own hair, yeah? But not many people can do that, so we rely on the expert hairdresser. Now, it sort of comes back to the last speaker in that we trust people to do certain things, and the more important it gets, we seem to trust people less and less. So when it comes to designing our places we live in, we have an inane, at the moment, distrust in all the experts. And so what I thought coming out of the sort of the way we deal with experts, now come back to Thaddeus's question, is that actually maybe experts are going to have a resurgence, and we will start listening to them like we should have listened to Kaye and all those previous experts. So I'd like to sort of think that politics and public community involvement and all the rest of it has its place, but it's proportionate to the scale of the issue we're dealing with. There you go. It's very profound.
Lovely, thank you. David's waving at me. David.
I am, yeah. Am I muted? I'm muted. No, I'm not. The point being that plan making is an intensely political process, and politicians have to be involved in plan making, advised properly by experts. Development management, or development control as I call it, isn't a political process. Politicians shouldn't be involved in that stage of the process at all, because the plans should be fixed, they should be binding, and therefore there is no discretion to be had in terms of whether something fits with the plan. So politicians should be removed from development management. Planning committees should be abolished, but they should be involved in plan making, absolutely.
I agree.
The nods from Thaddeus. Thank you, Thaddeus. Right, I said I was going to go to Steve and Tarry now. Steve and Tarry, introduce yourself, please.
Hello, yes, Stephen. I'm a development consultant and a student, all wrapped up in one. You've nicked my question, actually. It was going to be about democracy, so I will divert it slightly and just develop that a bit. I mean, there's this thing, in my experience, I agree, I'd love an expert-led system that had fewer politicians around to mess things up, but I don't know how realistic it is unless we're going to ditch democracy altogether. But I wonder if there's a way of just having an appropriate time scale in this, because the thing about buildings, asset management, development, all last for at least 30 years, whereas politicians are all here today, gone tomorrow, aren't they? If you're lucky, they last 10 years, or unlucky, the most, very often only live 5 years in the system, making decisions that are going to last for 30 years. And in housing, which I work in most, every 5 years, the policy flip-flops and you go from one thing to the other. You can't really plan anything. So I'm wondering if there's a space, without completely ditching the politicians, which I would quite like, is there a way of just resetting the time system that they all have to work in, so that they can't wreck everything every time they have a new ideology coming in to mess things up? So I'm just giving you a quick example. It springs to mind. There's loads actually, but Ken Livingstone, what struck me, is quite good on this in relation to Crossrail, because I think he did realise that it was going to take like 20, 30 years or something to fully do, well without the time he was going to be mayor, but nevertheless ploughed on with it, risking unpopularity, and of course eventually lost the mayoral thing anyway. There's that example, and also just to leave another little example, there's a Japanese football team amuses me because they have a 100-year plan to win the World Cup. So what they say is every 4 years when they pitch up wherever in a competition, their aim is not to win. Their aim is just a little bit better than what they did last time, because they had an appropriately long time scale to achieve the outcome they intend. So that's what I think. I wanted a solution there, because unfortunately I don't think we're going to get rid of a plan as much as we would like to. Sorry, not planners. I keep on saying that. Politicians. It's lovely.
Freudian slip.
Yeah.
Thank you, Stephen. That football team sounds like my football team. Would any of our panelists like to briefly come back on that? Otherwise, I'll move on to another question.
I can just briefly. I think it's all about the purpose of planning and what it's about. It's not necessarily about timescales and flip-flopping. If you have a set of criteria and the purpose is all about the environment and it's all about the decision-making you have to take, and everything flows from that, the decision-making, by the time it gets to the politician, they won't be able to move. They have to make it in the interests of the bigger picture and the what's in law. And that's what my point is really, that I want to make, so that we can't have this flip-flopping of decision-making.
Thank you, Jennifer. Right, let's move on and have some more questions. I should have said that you can raise your hand physically, but you can also use the raise hand function also on Zoom, which we used successfully on our High Street event. Right, has anybody else got a question? I'm going to try and pick up some of the chat. I think, Kathryn, if you're out there, you pose some questions. Would you mind unmuting yourself? And would you be happy to ask a question?
Hi.
Hi, Kathryn.
Well, we seem to be having a bit of a back and forth about going back to, I think it might have been Kaye's comment, or no, maybe it wasn't Kaye, I forget now, but about what an urban design expert is, and that got us into trying to grapple with, how do you define an expert that's an urban designer? What is an urban designer? We don't have the same RIBA or TCIP regulations or regulatory boards, which I think is a good thing, because we are very adept at bridging disciplines, in fact. And what I was actually typing when you called my name out was that, in fact, this is a debate that's going on in a lot of schools right now. Should planning and urban design be separate disciplines, or should they, in fact, be merged, or at least for part of that education be merged? And I think this, combined with some of the success we're seeing from public practice, the program Public Practice, maybe means that we need to just be rethinking these disciplines. Not saying that any one person is able to take on the world in its entirety of policy, and I put in brackets planning and urban design and the sort of 3-4 dimensional practice, but that perhaps there's something that something that's going to emerge where we're a little bit more fluid about the discipline, and that somehow takes a seat in planning departments, which maybe will stop being called planning departments even.
Mm-hmm. Yep, I think that's all good suggestions and other things that have come out in the chat. Speakers, would any of you like to come back on that? And
just totally agree.
I should say that that myself through Academy of Urbanism, and hi Kathryn, by the way,
Hello, David.
From
Nice
Boston, have been debating this with the Urban Design Group about whether we should have an accreditation system in the UK. And we had a meeting just before lockdown in the UK of all the architects from planning schools that teach urban design in the UK to debate this. And the problem is that it's possible to call yourself an urban designer in the UK without any training whatsoever. You can graduate from an architecture school without ever having done urban design. You can graduate from a planning school without ever having done urban design and call yourself an urban designer. And actually it shows in terms of the practice. And so we're sort of coming to the conclusion that we probably do need some sort of accreditation. We're talking to the RTPI in particular about whether we can include urban design as an expertise in the way that they accredit urban design courses, because no one is accrediting courses in the UK. The urban design courses are massively varied in terms of what they teach, and so yeah, it's great to have a open profession which everyone can join, but actually the quality of what we do, I think, suffers as a result of that.
I think that's a good point. I mean, we do have the recognised practitioner in urban design, which we have with the Urban Design Group, and those are looked at very properly. And I think practitioners who really want to get proper urban designers, and I know somewhat personally, because we've been hiring recently, we do, we look at whether someone's a recognised practitioner. But certainly we could do more there. Thank you, David. Malcolm, I gather you had a question.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, one thing I wanted to raise was the appeal system, which I think is really at the core of some of the problems in planning, is that we all know very well that the appeals are very expensive and local authorities usually can't afford to go to appeal against big developers. And I think we can all name big developers who we know that go to appeal on principle every single time they get refused permission. And usually they get their own way in the end because they can appoint sort of, planning lawyers who are going to run rings around the local authority. So I think we need to sort of change the whole thing, really, to say it should be a resolution system rather than a sort of, this loggerheads between two parties, then law sorting it out. We should see it as the idea of resolution. And if each party appointed an expert, let's say an urban designer, we say, and those two could agree how to resolve the main disputes between the two parties, and then take those back to their parties to say, well, we can agree, we think you should agree as well, without having to go to appeal. Shouldn't this be a way forward? I'm saying this because I did a project like that once, and it did work. I was appointed as an urban designer on one side for the local authority. The developer immediately appointed another urban designer, and we sat down and discussed these issues and came back and said, well, we think, these can be sorted out.
So any of our speakers like to come back on that? Urban designers doing things kind of in a back room, as it were, and avoiding an appeal. What do our speakers think of that?
In my planning system, there is no appeal.
Perfect planning.
It's gone to my system.
Utopia is a very dangerous thing, though, David. Occasionally,
it's not utopia. No, it's because you can't challenge the law because the policy is the law, and that there's no. So you can challenge whether it's been interpreted correctly, but not actually the content of it because it's the law. This is how it works across the world. Planning.
I think I'd agree with that as well. I have to say, you can give a bit of a.
Yeah, I mean, I would too.
Let's assume there is still an appeal system. So, what do we think the idea? How can we overcome this antagonistic approach, which is very expensive and time-consuming?
The point at the moment is it's geared towards developers and allowing them to do that. It's geared to, and what David's saying and what I'm saying is we need to flip it back into the sort of positive planning and what is planning all about, what are we trying to do, having robust plans, not talking about numbers and just saying it's all about numbers and you aren't delivering an economic. The whole paradigm has to shift, and I think that's coming. I'm a perpetual optimist, and I think it is coming. Appeals are very expensive and very long-winded, and you say developers always want to go to appeal, but they don't really. I mean, it's high risk and highly expensive. And, if we could get to a position where we could do what you said, resolve and actually, because they are motivated by creating good places. So I don't put myself in that that position of them and us. But I think we can push the planning system to be much, much better and proactive. And so they can't appeal and they don't want to appeal because we're moving in a more positive direction together. So that's my optimistic view.
I'd just like to add a point to that, is that apparently a third of appeals are successful. So, it's incredible,
isn't it? Yeah.
Amazing how many are. And it's not just actually the appeal system. I don't say developers necessarily want to appeal. The threat of appeal is usually sufficient to get their own way, isn't it?
But that's because the planning system has been so starved and strangled, and the government proactive push for economic growth as opposed to what they really should be pushing towards.
Okay.
Anybody else like to come back on that point?
I think that one of the reasons why so many appeals are successful is because the number of the refusals will be politically led refusals, whereas in most cases an officer's opinion would be based on interpretation of the policy. So the appeal system needs to be there, because if you don't have it, interpretation of the law and policy can be misconstrued or misinterpreted. But ultimately, where you have a situation where elected members are more interested in securing their next vote than they are necessarily about good planning, good placemaking, then that's where you're going to have numerous refusals, which then get lost at appeal.
Yeah. Anybody? Do we have any other questions? Anybody want to raise their hand or wave at me? I'm just flicking through on gallery view. I've got Colin Munsie, Justin Webber. Okay, if we could go to Colin Munsie first, then Justin Webber. We'll go for quite quick. I mean, I think after that we might call time on the formal bit, and we can carry on for as long as people want to do on the informal session. So, Colin Munsie, would you like to ask the question?
Leo, my feeling is that sometimes.
Colin, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, Colin Munsie, urban designer, architect, private consultant, and committee member of the UDG. My feeling is that sometimes in regions that urban design could be fostered if it was led by an intelligent governance. In other words, I thought that Kaye did a good job, and there was an atmosphere, there was a character that was set out, an expectation throughout the country as to what good design could be. And you see that, back in Rome when Pope Sixtus set out the basics for Rome right in the very early days. I don't know how much you knew about design, but there were certain guidance principles. The same with the Welsh Development Agency when it was kicking along. They had reasonable understanding as to what good urban design development meant. And so my feeling is that to some degree an intelligent governance authority could provide a fantastic guidance and set a character, make it part of the national ambience, the national character, as we see, say, to some degree in France. Design is kind of revered at a reasonably high level, and it's not put aside as being just an add-on that you plug into if you feel like it.
Good point. I'm sure many of our speakers would agree with that. I mean, very well done in getting kind of papal design and the Welsh Design Service into the same sentence, which is rather wonderful. So I think the question is, how would we do that? How can we bring design in so it's not just an add-on? Would any of our speakers like to come back on that point?
I feel as if I ought to, but I have to say I don't know. It's
$1 million question, isn't it?
I mean, all I can say is yes, I completely agree with you. What I've been trying to think of is where our most satisfactory planning processes and outcomes have ended, and I think they've probably ended in our best projects and our best schemes, a best quality design. And there has been a kind of symbiosis of design with the case officers and the consultants and the clients, but I think it's everybody actually being behind it. Like we've had clients who you frankly feel maybe are not giving enough time and energy into design, and you can see the local authority and design officers are trying to go, come on, this isn't good enough, we deserve better for this particular borough, and they've had kickbacks against it. And but I think it's everybody has to sign up to it. Everybody has to care about what the end product's going to be. That was a bit waffly and not a great answer.
I have one response, Leo.
Yeah,
a real incentive for people to sign up is money. If you do a flagship project and put in 600 million into a local community and put out the projects and say what you are hoping to do, you don't get the resistance is definitely diluted. You know, it's a great motivator if you can put up a plan and say that you have some seed capital that can help it kick along.
Yeah, I'm sure. Sorry, carry on, Kaye.
I was just also going to say, but you also get projects where there's, you know, unlimited amounts of money, not clients I've worked with, but where actually the outcome isn't that great, really. And so I don't think it is. I don't think it is just about money. I think it's about kind of cultural ethos of you know, what are you signing up to?
Absolutely.
I come to the conclusion in the book that actually most master planners are quite difficult people, and I think you could use a stronger word than that. But you look at, you know, Houseman and Longfine or Cedar and so on; they're all really, really awkward characters. And the best master planning clients are all dictators, even from Washington in America, or to Napoleon or whatever. Or we talk about Jar Singh from Jaipur in the book as well, which isn't a very comforting conclusion to come to as an urban designer, but actually it's complicated and it needs a lot of people, a lot of commitment to drive it through. So benign dictatorship is what you need, and I'm not sure that helps a great deal.
I think you need what you and Jennifer were talking about, is you need laws, you need planning, you need laws that are there's not as much wiggle room, you know. It's just you got to set it out and sign up to it and just get on with it.
I don't think money's everything, but having that to motivate people a little bit, and then to do what they've kind of like done in France, what they had done in Wales, is to make, and like we did with Kaye, is to make urban design and good design part of the culture. So you don't need awful lots of money. You need some to kick off a flagship project to show somebody what can be done, and then the rest follows suit. That's the way developers work. They create a flagship project to show what they're going to do, and everyone assumes that the rest is going to be as good as that. So, you know, set an example, create some leadership, and away you go.
Thanks, Colin. We've got time for maybe one or two more questions before we draw the kind of formal bit to an end. Justin, I said I'd come to you next. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Hello, Justin Webber from the RTPI Urban Design Network and Leicester City Council. Thanks, Leo. Really good range of speakers, interesting points tonight. Bit of a sort of undercurrent throughout of we should have benign dictatorships and rely on experts. As I think Jennifer's already alluded to, that issues of democratic deficit. It's not entirely a red herring, but I think we are at risk of over-exaggerating that particular aspect. As you all know, a relatively modest proportion of planning applications actually go to committee. Admittedly, a lot of the larger, more important urban design-led sort of urban extensions do, but an awful lot of development doesn't really go through that process anyway. So it is part of the issue, but I wouldn't say it's quite as dominant as all that. And of course, I think Robert rightly said in the comments, you know, what do we actually know that the great British public are entirely on board with what us as the experts are saying, and/or I think someone else, but you know, what exactly experts is not a sort of fixed variable. You know, as Jared Diamond wrote back in the day in one of his good books, you know, sort of the experts solve one problem and it facilitates a series of other problems that weren't anticipated. So I think there's a danger that we get a bit too simplistic about these sort of things. Nevertheless, I think the kind of overarching points from Jennifer and Colin, David and Jennifer, about flipping over the process to be more sophisticated, place-shaping, plan-led system rather than the antagonistic development. Well, yeah, I think we can all agree about that. But assuming that we're not going to get that paradigm shift immediately, although it would be interesting if we did, and it's more about the incremental improvements to the existing system, then up to a point, you know, a lot of the problems we have, ultimately, I'm not going to waffle on too much more, is because, you know, very talented architects like Kaye, who's getting frustrated by the system, she is a victim of the system which is manifested in lots of really rubbish developments coming forward with no architects involved. So the system is clogged up by very painful antagonistic back and forths with, if you like, bad faith developers, so to speak. So going back to Kaye's original point, I'd much rather be just talking to people like Kaye and pushing that design quality agenda forward in terms of an application. But we spend so much time bogged down dealing with, should we say, cynical stuff. And of course, David alluded to that. It's because of the land use planning system we have, land speculation, property values too high, etc. But we can't get away from that for the time being. And as someone in the comments said, under-resourced local authorities, yes, we would rather be doing this. But to kind of talk more positively about all that stuff that Kaye was saying, I completely agree. And I think this is something we definitely could do in the shorter term. Far better quality of information online, whether it be idiots' guides, YouTube stuff. There's a real opportunity there for us to explain the boring stuff in a much more accessible way, such that we can then spend more time as planners, urban designers, focusing on those more sophisticated design critiques and pushing that kind of thing forward. So yeah, lots of opportunities. And going back to Colin, who was just making those comments, I completely agree about exemplars, but back in the day, 10 years ago, I think I walked around an exemplar with Leo when we were slightly younger. And there are exemplars already, New Halls, Harlow and Uptons. There's lots of them already, but the problem is transferring them from being the anomaly to the standard. And as we do, it's economics, it's economies of scale, it's the devastating power of the market. So it's very difficult. But yeah, there's lots of interesting ways forward. And the pandemic, of course, a great point about internal space standards. I think we can all agree that has come to the fore. So I'm going to shut up. But yeah, it's really interesting stuff.
Thank you very, very much, Justin. Well, this is. I was meant to draw a close to the formal element of this evening at past. We're a bit after now. So